At the start of the 20th century, societies were already connected by powerful communication tools, yet each had clear limitations. Newspapers delivered information widely, but only in static text and photographs. Radio, which expanded rapidly after World War I, could transmit sound instantly across long distances, but it could not show images. Cinema offered moving pictures, yet films were recorded, edited, and distributed physically. They could not convey live events as they happened. These media worked independently rather than together, forcing people to rely on imagination to visualize distant voices or accept delays in seeing important events. This separation of sound and sight created a communication gap. Public speeches, sports events, theatrical performances, and breaking news could be heard on the radio, but not seen. Visual detail, facial expression, movement, context was lost. At the same time, photographs and newsreels could show images, but only after the fact. As societies became faster and more interconnected, this delay felt increasingly restrictive. People wanted not just to hear distant events, but to witness them in real time. The limitation was not a lack of curiosity, but a lack of suitable technology. Transmitting sound was comparatively simple because audio frequencies could be carried as electrical signals. Images, however, were complex. They required capturing light, breaking it into elements, converting those elements into electrical form, transmitting them, and then reconstructing them accurately at the receiving end. This challenge defined the central problem television aimed to solve: how to make vision travel the same way sound already did. Long before television became practical, scientists and engineers had explored the idea of transmitting images electrically. By the late 19th century, researchers understood that images could be analyzed into smaller parts. The concept of scanning, examining an image line by line or point by point, was already established in theory. Experiments with photoelectric materials showed that light intensity could be converted into electrical variation, suggesting that visual information could be transformed into signals. One influential idea was the mechanical scanning method, which proposed that rotating discs with patterned holes could break an image into sequential elements. Each element could then be transmitted as a changing electrical signal. While these ideas were conceptually sound, practical implementation was extremely difficult. Components were fragile, light-sensitive materials were inefficient, and synchronization between sending and receiving devices was hard to maintain. Despite these challenges, scientific curiosity persisted. The early 20th century was a period of rapid electrical innovation, with advances in motors, radio transmission, and amplification. These developments did not immediately produce television, but they created the conditions in which image transmission could be tested seriously. The idea of seeing at a distance was no longer speculative. It had become a technical goal, waiting for a workable system. The promise of television went beyond novelty. Moving images carried information that sound alone could not. Facial expressions, gestures, environments, and spatial relationships added layers of meaning. For education, this meant demonstrations and visual explanations could reach audiences far from classrooms. For news, it meant viewers could see events unfold rather than rely on second-hand descriptions. For entertainment, it meant performances could be shared simultaneously across cities and nations. This shift represented a change in how people related to information. Television reduced the distance between observer and event. It created a shared visual experience, allowing large audiences to witness the same images at the same time. Unlike cinema, which required people to gather in theaters, television promised access within homes, making visual communication part of daily life. Importantly, television did not replace existing media immediately. Instead, it combined elements of radio and film into a new form. Sound and image became synchronized, creating a more complete representation of reality. This completeness explained why inventors continued pursuing television despite technical difficulty. The value of live visual communication justified years of experimentation, limited funding, and uncertain outcomes. Early television demonstrations were modest by modern standards. Images were small, low in resolution, and unstable, yet they proved a crucial point. Moving images could be transmitted electrically and reproduced at a distance. Once this principle was demonstrated, improvement became inevitable. Engineers refined scanning methods, increased image clarity, and developed better synchronization and amplification. Public demonstrations attracted attention from broadcasters, governments, and manufacturers. Television slowly moved from experimental rooms into institutional support structures. Broadcasting organizations recognized its potential as a mass medium, while governments saw its value for information and public communication. Over time, technical standards emerged, production increased, and television sets entered ordinary households. The ultimate success of television lay in its adaptability. Although early systems, such as mechanical television, were eventually replaced by electronic methods, the core idea remained the same: converting visual reality into transmittable signals and reconstructing it elsewhere. Television reshaped politics, culture, education, and entertainment by making visual presence routine rather than exceptional. What began as an attempt to overcome the limits of radio and print became one of the most influential technologies of the modern world. Television succeeded not because it was immediately perfect, but because it addressed a fundamental human desire: to see as well as hear across distance. John Logie Baird was born on August 13, 1888, in Helensburgh, Scotland, a coastal town near Glasgow. He grew up in a stable, educated household. His father, the Reverend John Baird, was a Church of Scotland minister, and his mother, Jessie Morrison Inglis, came from a family that valued learning and discipline. This environment encouraged curiosity, reading, and independent thinking from an early age. As a child, Baird showed an unusual interest in how things worked. He experimented with basic mechanical and electrical ideas, often using household materials. Unlike children drawn primarily to play, Baird spent long hours assembling simple devices and observing cause and effect relationships. His curiosity was not driven by competition or display, but by a desire to understand processes. Baird's childhood, however, was marked by fragile health. He suffered from recurring illnesses, including respiratory problems, which frequently interrupted his schooling and limited physical activity. These health constraints shaped his temperament. He became more introspective, patient, and comfortable working alone, traits that later proved essential during long periods of experimental isolation. Living near industrial Glasgow also mattered. The region was surrounded by shipbuilding, electrical manufacturing, and engineering innovation. Even without direct access to factories, Baird absorbed the atmosphere of technical progress. His early influences combined moral structure from family life, curiosity about mechanics, and a quiet resilience developed through illness. Baird's formal education reflected both ambition and disruption. He attended Larchfield Academy and later the Royal Technical College in Glasgow, where he studied electrical engineering. He also spent time at the University of Glasgow. While he never completed a degree, his exposure to engineering principles, electrical systems, and applied physics was substantial. His studies coincided with rapid developments in radio, telephony, and electrical transmission. These fields captured his attention more than conventional academic success. Baird was less interested in examinations and more focused on experimenting with ideas outside structured coursework. He read widely, studied patents, and followed emerging technologies with careful attention. Health issues continued to interfere with his studies. Periods of illness forced him to pause or withdraw from formal education. Rather than discouraging him, these interruptions pushed Baird towards self-directed learning. He developed the habit of teaching himself through trial, observation, and repeated experimentation, an approach that later defined his inventive work. Bayard's education did not produce a polished academic or corporate engineer. Instead, it shaped a practical problem solver. He learned enough theory to understand electrical systems, but relied heavily on hands-on testing. This balance between conceptual understanding and improvisation allowed him to explore unconventional approaches when established methods failed. After leaving formal education, Bayard pursued various business ventures, many of which failed. He attempted to manufacture products such as electric razors, glass items, and chemical compounds. These efforts were often poorly funded and commercially unsuccessful, but they taught him valuable lessons about materials, production constraints, and practical engineering limits. Financial instability became a recurring challenge. Bayard frequently worked with minimal resources, relying on borrowed equipment, recycled materials, and improvised workspaces. These conditions forced him to be inventive with limited means. Instead of discouraging him, repeated failure reinforced persistence and adaptability. Bayard's health continued to affect his working life. Long periods of illness limited his ability to hold stable employment. This instability made independent experimentation not just a preference, but a necessity. Working alone allowed him to control pace, environment, and recovery. During this period, Bayard developed the resilience that defined his later achievements. He learned to accept uncertainty, manage disappointment, and continue experimenting without external validation. These years of struggle formed the practical and psychological foundation for his later work on television, where progress was slow and recognition uncertain. In 1931, John Logie Baird married Margaret Albu, a pianist and accomplished individual in her own right. Their marriage provided emotional stability during a demanding phase of Bayard's life. Margaret's support was especially important given Bayard's ongoing health challenges and intense focus on technical work. Marriage did not change Bayard's working habits dramatically, but it provided balance. He continued to work long hours and pursue experimental ideas, yet benefited from personal structure and encouragement. This stability helped sustain him during periods of technical difficulty and professional competition. Bayard's personal life remained relatively private. He did not cultivate public attention or self-promotion. His identity was centered on problem-solving rather than recognition. Even after achieving fame for television demonstrations, he remained focused on improving systems rather than defending status. By the time Bayard advanced his work in television, his character was well-formed. Early family discipline, interrupted education, persistent illness, repeated failure, and eventual personal support shaped an inventor suited to long-term experimentation. His achievements were not the result of sudden inspiration, but of a life steadily oriented toward understanding and overcoming technical limits. John Logie Bayard's journey toward television did not begin with a complete vision of a finished system. Instead, it started with a simple question that many engineers of his time were asking. If sound could be transmitted electrically through radio waves, why could images not be transmitted in a similar way? Bayard approached this question from a practical, mechanical perspective rather than a purely theoretical one. In the early 1920s, Bayard began experimenting with image transmission using mechanical components. He was aware of earlier theoretical work, particularly the concept of scanning an image line by line. Rather than waiting for advanced components to become available, he chose to test these ideas using whatever materials he could access. Cardboard, bicycle lamps, lenses, sewing needles, and old motors became part of his experimental toolkit. Bayard's early systems focused on breaking an image into parts using a rotating scanning device. The core idea was to convert varying light intensity from an object into electrical signals, transmit those signals, and then reconstruct them as light at the receiving end. This approach aligned with existing knowledge of radio transmission and electrical amplification. However, the challenge was achieving synchronization between scanning and display, as even slight mismatches caused distorted images. These early experiments were crude and unreliable. Images were often unstable, faint, or incomplete, yet they demonstrated that moving visual information could be transmitted using mechanical scanning. This stage of Baird's work was not about success, but about feasibility. He was proving to himself that the basic principle could work. Baird's experimental work accelerated after he moved to Hastings and later to London. Working in modest rooms and makeshift laboratories, he built increasingly complex prototypes. One of his key components was the Nipkow disc, a rotating disc with a spiral pattern of holes that scanned an image sequentially. By synchronizing discs at both the transmitting and receiving ends, Baird attempted to reconstruct images accurately. The technical obstacles were significant. Light-sensitive cells of the time were inefficient, producing weak electrical signals. Motors were inconsistent in speed, causing synchronization drift. Amplification was limited, and electrical noise frequently overwhelmed the signal. As a result, early images were low resolution and flickered constantly. Failures were frequent. Components overheated, discs warped, and images collapsed into unrecognizable patterns. Baird documented these failures carefully, adjusting hole sizes, rotation speeds, and light sources. Each iteration provided data that informed the next version. Despite limited funding and poor health, Baird persisted. His strength was not superior equipment, but systematic experimentation. He focused on isolating problems rather than abandoning the system entirely. This methodical refinement allowed gradual improvement, transforming unstable experiments into repeatable demonstrations. By 1925 and 1926, Baird achieved a breakthrough: recognizable moving images transmitted electrically and displayed at a distance. One of his most cited demonstrations involved the transmission of a human face, showing basic facial features and movement. Although image quality was low, the result was unmistakable: television was possible. In January 1926, Baird publicly demonstrated his television system to members of the Royal Institution in London. This event marked a turning point. For the first time, a working television system was shown to a scientific audience in a controlled setting. The demonstration was not theatrical, it was technical. Observers saw live moving images produced through electrical transmission rather than film. These demonstrations validated Baird's approach. They showed that mechanical scanning could transmit moving images reliably enough for observation. This success attracted attention from the press, investors, and broadcasters. Importantly, it also encouraged institutional engagement, moving television from private experimentation into public evaluation. Baird continued refining his system after these demonstrations, increasing image stability and experimenting with longer transmission distances. His work laid the foundation for television broadcasting, even though many technical limitations remained. Following his early successes, Baird gained recognition as a pioneer of television. He established the Baird Television Development Company and conducted further demonstrations, including long-distance transmissions and early color television experiments. His systems were adopted experimentally by broadcasters, including the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, which used Baird's mechanical television system for early broadcasts. At the same time, competition intensified. Other engineers, particularly those working on electronic television systems using cathode ray tubes, began developing alternatives. Electronic systems promised higher resolution, greater stability, and scalability. While Baird continued improving mechanical television, it became increasingly clear that electronic methods would eventually dominate. Despite this shift, Baird's contribution remained essential. He demonstrated that television was not only theoretically possible, but practically achievable. His work established broadcasting practices, audience engagement, and technical benchmarks that later systems refined. Baird's journey to television was not defined by final dominance, but by foundational success. He transformed an abstract idea into a working medium, proving that moving images could be transmitted and received in real time. This achievement reshaped communication and opened the path for the fully electronic television systems that followed. At its foundation, television works by converting visible scenes into electrical information that can be transmitted over distance and then reconstructed as moving images. The central challenge is that an image is not a single piece of information. It is a complex arrangement of light intensities across space. Television solves this by breaking the image into smaller elements and processing them sequentially. Early television systems, including John Logie Baird's, relied on the principle of scanning. Instead of attempting to transmit an entire image at once, the system analyzed it line by line. Each line was converted into a changing electrical signal that represented variations in brightness. When these lines were transmitted rapidly one after another, the human eye perceived them as a continuous moving image. This approach aligned with the limitations of early electrical systems. Continuous electrical variation was easier to transmit than complex spatial information. By reducing vision to a time-based sequence, television made visual transmission manageable with existing technology. The idea of scanning was not unique to television, but Baird was among the first to implement it successfully for live moving images. This principle, breaking images into time-based signals, remains central to television even in modern digital systems. Baird's television system was mechanical rather than electronic. Its core component was the Nipkow disc, a rotating disc with a spiral pattern of holes. As the disc rotated, each hole scanned a small portion of the image. Together, the holes traced out the entire image line by line during each rotation. At the transmitting end, light from the subject passed through the rotating disc and struck a light-sensitive cell. As different parts of the image were scanned, the amount of light hitting the cell changed. These changes produced corresponding variations in an electrical signal. Brighter areas generated stronger signals. Darker areas produced weaker ones. At the receiving end, a synchronized disc rotated at the same speed. The electrical signal controlled the brightness of a light source behind the disc. As the disc rotated, this light recreated the scanned image in the same sequence. Synchronization between the two discs was critical. Any mismatch caused distortion or loss of image stability. Although mechanically complex and limited in resolution, this system demonstrated that live images could be transmitted and reconstructed using rotating components and electrical signals. Once the image was converted into an electrical signal, it could be transmitted using standard communication methods of the time, including wired connections or radio waves. The signal carried no visual information directly. Instead, it encoded brightness changes over time. At the receiver, the signal controlled a light source, often a neon or incandescent lamp. As the signal fluctuated, the brightness of the lamp changed accordingly. When viewed through the rotating disc, these brightness changes formed visible shapes and motion. Sound transmission followed a separate but parallel process. Audio signals were transmitted alongside the video signal, allowing synchronized sound and image. Early systems struggled with alignment and clarity, but the principle of combined audiovisual transmission was established. The limitations were significant. Mechanical systems offered low resolution, limited frame rates, and small image sizes. However, they provided proof that television was technically feasible. These early reconstruction methods defined the basic workflow that later electronic systems refined rather than replaced. Baird's mechanical television system was eventually overtaken by fully electronic television, which used cathode ray tubes and electronic scanning rather than rotating discs. Electronic systems offered higher resolution, greater stability, and scalability, making them more suitable for mass broadcasting. Despite this transition, Baird's technical legacy is substantial. He demonstrated the practical reality of television, established early broadcasting standards, and introduced concepts such as scanning, synchronization, and signal-based image reconstruction. These ideas carried forward into electronic and later digital television systems. Modern television still follows the same fundamental logic: capture light, convert it into electrical or digital signals, transmit those signals, and reconstruct them as images. The tools have changed, but the process remains conceptually consistent. Baird's work represents a critical stage in technological evolution. Mechanical television was not the final form, but it was an essential bridge between theory and practice. By proving that television could work, Baird enabled later engineers to improve and expand the medium. His contribution lies not in the permanence of his hardware, but in establishing television as a viable and transformative form of communication.